This week, we welcome writer Rob Henderson.
If a sort of a typical conventional working or middle class person in society thinks one way about a sociopolitical issue, a very good way to demonstrate your sophistication and your status is to hold the opposite opinion. It's also an indicator of, all kinds of things, the kinds of books you read, the op-eds, the fashionable periodicals. Claiming that abolishing the police would be good for society, you have to do a lot of mental gymnastics that indicate that, like, you read the New York Times, you went to an expensive college, you listen to the right podcasts. Like, just by supporting that opinion, you're telling me all these things about yourself, and maybe you want me to know those things about you. There is a sort of a class element here. I think many of the people who hold luxury beliefs hold them sincerely, but I still think it's important for people who hold them to understand that even if your heart's in the right place, it doesn't mean that society will necessarily be better off. And often there are these unintended consequences. They cause a lot of havoc for lower income communities.
This is Walk-Ins Welcome with Bridget Phetasy. I'm Bridget Phetasy, and you are welcome. You know the drill. Please subscribe, rate, comment, share, reach out, tell your friends, send smoke signals, whatever. We love your feedback and we want to hear from you. If you like our work and want to support us, the best way to do that is join Phetasy.com. You'll get access to behind-the-scenes content, outtakes, discounts on merch, and the ability to submit questions for some of our upcoming guests. Support your favorite scrappy little internet heroes at Phetasy.com. I'm with Rob Henderson, everybody. Welcome to Walk-Ins Welcome.
Hey, Bridget. Great to be here.
Thank you for coming. I've been wanting to talk to you for actually years, I think, at this point. I first was introduced to you, like many people, through the concept of luxury beliefs, which I feel like I bring up every other podcast that I've had recently. It just is such a brilliant term. Can you just briefly give us an idea of what you mean by luxury beliefs?
Yeah. I define luxury beliefs as ideas and opinions that confer status on the upper class while often inflicting costs on the lower classes. And I created this framework after, well, I guess the beginnings of it, they originated when I was at Yale as an undergrad. I was, what they call a non-traditional or a mature student. So, I just finished up at Cambridge here with a PhD. I was at Yale before this, but before I entered these fancy universities, my life was a lot different. I grew up in California, living in foster homes, and joined the military when I was 17. As soon as I graduated high school, I had to have my adoptive mother sign these documents because I was underage. I had to persuade her to let me go, and so I left home as soon as I could, spent a few years in the military, and then I arrived at Yale on the GI Bill. And so, I had different experiences moving along the American social class ladder, sort of born into poverty, about as poor as you can be in America, at least. And in the foster homes, and, when I was adopted later, these were more sort of working class, lower middle class, sort of on that boundary. Joined the military, made friends who were more middle class. And then by the time I got to Yale, I was sort of ensconced in, one of the richest universities in the world. A place like Yale, there's more, there was a big report in the New York Times a few years ago. There's more students at Yale from the top 1% of income, family background, top 1%, than the entire bottom 60% of the American income scale. So
Wow.
these students are extremely well off, most of them. And I started to encounter strange opinions that were very much at odds with, common sense beliefs and notions. And we can get into some specific examples, but I realized that these students and these graduates who wield disproportionate economic and social and cultural power were broadcasting and espousing publicly beliefs that oftentimes they themselves in their private lives didn't adhere to. But they seem very pleased with themselves when they express them nonetheless. So.
Can you give us some examples?
I guess the most prominent one that I've written about, and that is more personal to me, is this denigration, this undermining of monogamy and marriage and just stable relationship structures. So I guess the beginnings of this, this idea of this luxury belief. I had this conversation with the former classmate of mine. She went to Yale. She graduated from law school. Now she's doing very well. And so she was telling me a few years ago, oh, this, I think marriage is kind of outdated. I think it's this sort of outmoded idea. It's sort of rooted in patriarchy, monogamy, and marriage, and this whole thing, and we should evolve beyond it. And that was the first time I ever heard about this. I mean, this was like 2015 or 2016. I'd never heard someone like say that we should evolve beyond marriage. I was pretty new to those kinds of opinions. And I asked her, well, like, I thought about my life. Then I asked her, like, well, how did you grow up? Like, what, did you grow up in like, some kind of a situation where this wasn't the case, where people around you weren't married? And she said, well, no, my parents were married. It's sort of, typical nuclear family. And then I asked, well, what are you going to do later? Like, are you going to get married? What is your plan for the future? And she said, well, I was raised that way. I'll probably continue to do that for my kids too. But just because I'm going to do it doesn't mean it should be for everyone. I do think it's rooted in, historical oppression and these interlocking systems of blah, blah, just this sort of jargon. And I'm like, okay, so this person benefited from this sort of traditional stable family structure, and she intended to carry it forward for her own children. But she was very adamant that other people, shouldn't do this, or should not be obliged to do it. And she was very much like recommending the opposite, in fact, despite the fact that she herself, was doing these things. And then, I realized, later just how different, people who inhabit these institutions, how their lives were compared to, the sort of working class and poor communities I grew up in. I remember I was in a class once at Yale, and the professor administered this anonymous survey asking how many of the students, there were about 20 students in this class, how many of us had been raised by both of our birth parents. So this anonymous survey, we responded, and the professor put the results up on the slide. And out of 20 some students, there were only 2 that were not raised by both of their birth parents. It was me and one other student. And I saw this pattern repeated, just asking people, having conversations with people. And then I actually dug into a lot of the research, the sort of survey data on, people who attend the most elite institutions in America. What was their family background? It's overwhelmingly that they were raised by both birth parents.
Wow.
And that was true for none of my friends growing up. In high school, there was a sort of a core group of like me and 5 other guys, like 6 of us. None of us were raised by both of our birth parents. I was raised by foster parents, foster homes. I had friends raised by single moms, one who was raised by a single dad. One was raised by his grandmother because his mom was addicted to drugs and his dad had gone off to prison. And so these were like the common stories where I grew up. And I'm like, okay, so the people who are sort of denigrating the importance of stable, functional, healthy relationships, they're benefiting from them, but then they're telling everyone else not to do it. And so there was this mismatch from what they were saying versus what they were doing.
That's really interesting. I think a lot about when I had the Women's Liberation Front. 2 of the women came on my podcast, and they were talking about luxury beliefs without necessarily calling it that, but they were saying they look a lot at what their supposed allies are doing versus what they're saying, because, and in their example, it's sex work is work. And they say, that crowd will say, oh, go be a sex worker. Sex work is work. And they'll espouse these beliefs, but they're not in any way, shape, or form encouraging their daughters to go become sex workers.
There was a piece I read about a year ago about a former prostitute, a former sex worker who, basically was railing against this very point about how this was an extremely like unpleasant experience, like living that kind of life, and how there are so many people, the prominent academics, women who, were born and sort of raised in upper middle class environments, and who would never themselves partake in this activity and would definitely not steer their daughters into it. And yet they'll write books and op-eds and go on, go on TV and stuff. And they'll just like talk about how great this is and how we need to normalize it. And yet, and in some cases they would say, well, it's work like anything else. And this particular piece, I wish I remembered this woman's name, but she said, imagine one of these prominent female professors going up to the custodian, the female custodian who mops the floors at the university and says, well, what you're doing is no different than sex work, so why don't you just like give this up and go hook up with some strangers instead. They would never even think to do anything like that. Yeah, it's a very, very good piece. I'll send it to you later.
Yeah, please. I think a lot too about how these luxury beliefs generally, when they are applied, even if say that there's a class difference in the application of them, the people at the bottom are suffering the consequences of it. So Abigail Schreier just had a piece out about this idea that we essentially stopped punishing people for prostituting. They made it harder for police to. It was like an anti-loitering law or something like that. And so she went out on with some people who are helping to rescue trafficked women. And now it makes it much harder for police to intervene, particularly with young, underage, often trafficked women, because they don't have the kind of pretense that they had before to stop this. And it's always these women, it feels like the Wolf women came on to talk about the fight they have about allowing men who are self-IDing into the California prison system. So they're suing the California prison system for allowing this because the women in these prisons are being abused and raped and all the horrible things you would guess would happen with this situation. And It's easy for these people to just be in their gated communities and say things like defund the police and let men self-ID into prisons and not have to really face any of the ramifications of that.
Right. Yeah. The people who are advocating for allowing biological men into women's prisons, well, they themselves will never go to prison. They'll never be incarcerated. Yeah. They have no family members who will ever be incarcerated. I mean, yeah, they're so removed from that reality of living a life that would lead you to become incarcerated. They don't have to worry about it. And the defund the police idea too. Living in a gated community. I mean, it was so interesting to see what was happening simultaneously as, at the height of 2020 and 2021 calls to abolish the police. There were all these reports of rich people in Manhattan who were fleeing to the Hamptons and people in Chicago who were hiring private off-duty police officers to patrol their neighborhoods and bodyguards and so forth. And yeah, it was unbelievable. There was a survey in YouGov that I've shared before about how in 2021, if you break it down by income category, the highest income category were the most supportive of defunding the police, and the lowest income category was the least supportive. And to me, this makes sense because if you look at who's actually victimized by crime, it's disproportionately poor people. I mean, we focus a lot on the fact that a lot of crimes are disproportionately committed by poor people, low income people. But their victims are also, people who are within proximity to them, people who are also poor and low income. And there's way, way more victims than there are criminals. I mean, there was a study that found that 63% of violent crimes are only committed by 1% of the population. Wow. And so it's a very tiny number of mostly young men who target oftentimes, we think of this category of poor as just this, it flattens differences between the poor. Well, if you have like a poor young man victimizing poor people, often the poor people he's victimizing are elderly women or, children or small, basically, just people who would be relatively soft targets, people who are even more vulnerable than himself. And yet people seem to take much more pity on the young criminal than the elderly victim, which I find, this is a strange misguided empathy.
Do you have any theories as to why this misguided empathy feels so pervasive right now?
Well, I think that for people who are relatively affluent and highly educated, their only exposure to poor people is through so one is through like sort of fictional illustrations of poverty. So sort of these stylized, TV shows and movies or books. And then the other is basically when a criminal is arrested and there's like a high profile case of someone committing a crime, so much attention is paid to the perpetrator and relatively little to the victim. And so, they learn about the criminal and the person's backstory and what they went through and so forth, and relatively little about what the crimes they may have committed. And then in TV shows, it's just more interesting to see someone, like Breaking Bad or something, like someone who's just sort of fed up with the system and decides to become a criminal because their lives have gone so awry. It's just not exciting to see the life of the typical low income person, which is, they wake up, they work a relatively menial job for minimum wage. Maybe they work 2 of these jobs, do their best to take care of their family, and go home and call it a day. Like that's the life of a normal, but it's not exciting to depict that. It's much more exciting to say like, oh, he's barely getting by and now it's time to rob a bank. And like, yeah,
Right.
it's time to fight back against the system. And that's a very small number of people. Most poor people are doing their best to obey the law, do the right thing. And they don't like criminals, as that survey that I referenced before indicated.
Yeah, this is something I really think a lot about because for all of the talk about privilege, this seems like the ultimate privilege to be able to try and put these policies or institutionalize this stuff when it really actually affects people who are not as privileged as you. Yeah. And there just seems like such a strange disconnect. And I'm wondering, I know there's been some writing and talking. I think I've talked to Batya about this as well, Batya Sargon, about, is this a way to hide the class war? Is it, what is your theory about why this has been, the kind of elites have been so captured by these beliefs?
Yeah, well, so the luxury beliefs idea, in addition to my sort of firsthand observations of class dynamics, I've also supported it with research from sort of old school theories from sociology and economics of basically 100 plus years ago. When Thorstein Veblen, he was an old economist and sociologist from the late 19th century, he wrote this book, The Theory of the Leisure Class. And that book was all about how, 100 plus years ago, the elites of that time, they demonstrated their social class, their status through expensive material goods, through luxury goods. The men wore very expensive tuxedos and top hats, and the women wore these evening gowns, and they partook in these expensive hobbies, golf and beagling and going to expensive dinners. And but as societies have become relatively more materially wealthy, goods have become a noisier signal of social status. So, if you walk down a major city in America, well, if you did this 100 years ago, it would be very apparent who was rich and who was poor 100 years ago, just by the way they were dressed and the way they looked. Today, it's less so. I mean, there's still some subtle indicators. It's not a completely mistaken to just look at someone and roughly guess, maybe they have some money or not. Yeah. But it's just harder to do this.
And, I have a game in LA where it's homeless or trust fund baby.
yeah. So it's become it's more difficult now. Yeah, I think LA and San Francisco, those might be some good places to. So the new way to demonstrate your status in society is through your beliefs, through having novel or peculiar ideas. If a sort of a typical conventional working or middle class person in society thinks one way about a sociopolitical issue, a very good way to demonstrate your sophistication and your status is to hold the opposite opinion or to hold a differing opinion. And it's also an indicator of, all kinds of things, the kinds of books you read, the op-eds, the fashionable periodicals, all of these, like coming up with a, like claiming that abolishing the police would be good for society. You have to do a lot of mental gymnastics that indicate that, like, you read the New York Times, you went to an expensive college, you listen to the right podcasts. Like, just by supporting that opinion, you're telling me all these things about yourself, and maybe you want me to know those things about you. And so I think there is a sort of a class element here of, I don't know if class war is strong. I think many of the people who hold luxury beliefs hold them sincerely. But I still think it's important for people who hold them to recognize where they came from and to understand that, even if you even if your heart's in the right place, it doesn't mean that society will necessarily be better off. And often there are these unintended consequences. Often you can hold beliefs sincerely and think that they're right, and they cause a lot of havoc for lower income communities.
I noticed this a lot during the Trump election, actually, and people would be talking about, for instance, like the immigrant community and all of these. But I was working in a restaurant, and not everybody was anti-Trump. There was a lot of people who came into the United States, and they were kind of very much pull the ladder up behind them, but they did it the right way. And I was surprised. It was eye-opening to me to learn to be schooled by a lot of people that there was a lot of animosity towards Trump and with the people I worked with, but it was not all across the board. And so when these people online were like, "Oh, you guys are, the Latin community is very anti," I'm like, they're not, though. They're not all. This is just me realizing that you don't know a single person that you're speaking on behalf of.
Yeah,
because if you did, you would realize it's not just they're not all in lockstep on this opinion.
Right. Well, often the people who are of whatever ethnic minority backgrounds, they it's funny, like sort of your education and your income too, to some degree, but education primarily is a far stronger predictor now of your political views than your ethnicity. So if you go to like a certain occupational field, like in the media or in academia, people will think that certain groups think in a certain way, but that's just because the people they interact with tend to share those beliefs, but they don't spend a lot of time in lower income areas where there's actually quite a bit more diversity of opinion and viewpoints. Sort of outside of that sort of upper middle class echo chamber where everyone is, it seems like everyone agrees, because the people who disagree are afraid to express their opinions. There's so many, there's plenty of survey data now on self-censorship, and the self-censorship tends to increase with levels of education. So people with postgraduate degrees are much more likely to self-censor than people with only a high school education. So it's very, just this sort of chilling effect. The higher up you go.
That's really interesting. Why is that? Is that just fear about status?
Yeah, I think there's a part of that. I mean, so the survey from YouGov, this was in 2019, I want to say. So this was even before 2020 and all of the fallout there. But it was 25% of high school graduates. So people whose highest level of education was a high school diploma, 25% said they would self-censor for fear of getting fired or ruining their economic job prospects. And then it was a little over 30% for high school, for college graduates. And then for postgraduates, people with an advanced degree, it was 44%. So it's almost twice as high as for high school only. So people with advanced degrees. And I think there is this element of sort of status of, in white collar occupations. Oftentimes your job is not directly tied to your, like, the goods you produce or the value you provide, but and sort of it's the opinions you proclaim, it's your relationships with other people. I mean, so like the higher up you go, the relationships become so much more important to get certain jobs, networking, those kinds of things, and people become much more afraid of saying the wrong thing and losing their reputational status.
I think too, one of the things I've noticed and I really appreciate about you, because you've been able to straddle these two worlds, and you were in the military, which I would like to get to as well, but I didn't have to self-censor when I was waiting tables or when my brother was working on construction sites. You hear about, or in the military, the jokes that we made working in that kind of environment are so inappropriate, and everybody's roasting everybody all the time, and it's there's a sense of camaraderie, but you're not really worried about getting in trouble. You're going to get in trouble for sexual harassment. That's maybe maybe in the restaurant industry, maybe not. I mean, maybe now more than when I came up in the industry.
Yeah.
And it was when I started encountering a lot of people who came out of academia and all, I still don't feel like I belong. In a lot of ways, I still feel like an outsider when I'm at a table with a lot of people who basically only went through never really worked a job like that. I still feel like there's some disconnect and I cannot relate to them on some weird way. I can understand everything they're saying.
Yeah.
It just feels like they lived a almost in a parallel reality. They were usually the people I was waiting on. And so it feels like I've somehow snuck, from downstairs in Downton Abbey to like the upstairs table and somehow became that I still wrestle with this feeling. And I wonder, what is your sense of the reason that people who have lower education are not self-censoring as much?
Yeah, it's a good question. I worked in restaurants too. My first job, I was a dishwasher. I was still in high school making, so this was in California in 2006 ish, 6.25 an hour. I remember, so I was in California a year or two ago. And my sister told me, the minimum wage in California is $15 an hour now. I'm like, $15 an
Yeah,
hour.
you
I was
can
like, I
make
mean, it
good
wasn't
money.
2006 wasn't that long ago. I'm like, I think they owe me back pay. Like why 6.25 an hour compared to $15 an hour? I know inflation hasn't increased that much. So
It's
um,
$2.89, Rob, in
yeah,
Rhode Island. I got paid
289.
$2.89 to be a waitress.
Wow. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's yeah, maybe they owe you some back pay too. um and yeah, I remember like the jokes we would like, it's funny. So I was telling you, I'm working on this memoir, and I most of it is like, unfiltered, just I just write the way that we spoke back then. But there were some jokes that were so egregious, like, I'll leave this one out. But like, yeah, there were, and we had like in the restaurant, especially in the back, the cooks and everything. It was like every ethnicity, every kind of
Yep.
person, and like, every joke imaginable was on the table. It was fine.
Yeah.
And the military was the same way too. Um, and then yeah, I get to college, and it's, everyone's tiptoeing around, walking on eggshells, very careful with what they say. I mean, really, it's kind of, there were two acceptable groups from, well, maybe three. You could make fun of men. You could make fun of like white people in general. Sometimes you could like isolate it, like white men, white women were acceptable targets. And then like the straights, right? Like heterosexual people.
Straight.
Yeah.
Christians, too, I feel are very.
I think that's right, but I didn't hear quite as much. Like, well, like if you were going to make fun of a religion, that's like the safe one to do. You should definitely none of the others.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, and that was like an interesting, because at first I thought like, oh, like there is no like we've sort of collected, because that was my first inkling. Like as I was sort of getting a sense of how people are behaving, I'm like, okay, so you're not really allowed to make fun of people based on like gender, race, and stuff anymore. And they really take it seriously. Because I remember in the military, we would get these briefings about how, no, you're not allowed to make these jokes, blah, blah, blah. That was the official stance. But then privately, we'd make the jokes anyway. At
Yeah.
college, it was like, no, you really don't. I mean, maybe in a party when people are drunk and no one can hear sometimes, but not really. But then I gradually came to learn, oh, there are acceptable groups that you could publicly make fun of. But these are like I don't know, the historically dominant groups or something. Like then it's okay, which I found interesting that, there was an interesting sort of set of intellectual acrobatics about how certain groups are okay because of these historically contingent reasons. So I was like, okay, so this is like, you just signaling sophistication about why you can, shit on some people but not others. I don't know if you're allowed to. I don't know if you're allowed to swear here.
Yeah, definitely.
So, but yeah, why? I think it's yeah, I think part of it is like social climbing. People are looking for ways to undercut their competitors. I saw a lot of this in college and in grad school. People who are, trying to like find dirt on other people to undermine them in their quest for professional accolades, or getting into law school or finance internships. Just like just taking screenshots of chats if someone said something potentially inappropriate. Whereas, if you're working, as a dishwasher or something, those opportunities just aren't as readily available. If and plus, like people just care less anyway. So
I
yeah, there's
also
just
think
an honesty.
you're more, sorry, and to interrupt, I think you're more in the world. So it's harder. You're not screenshotting. You're on your feet. In these jobs, you're actually working. So you're not texting with people. You're not in a Slack chat. You're just talking shit while you're bringing your dishes back to the dishwasher and then coming out of the kitchen. And on the jobs, like the construction jobs where I know it's all these jobs. It's funny. There does seem to be such a disconnect to me, and particularly as someone who's in comedy and goes, sees audiences around the country, and there's such a disconnect between the quote unquote working class and the kind of laptop class, and the way I'm like, do you guys not know how people talk? Like,
Yeah.
a whole huge population of the country versus the way you're presenting. It's very strange to me. That more than anything else, for all the talk about two Americas, that makes me feel like there are two Americas.
Yeah. Well, I think like a lot of the opinions seem to be divided more by class than by politics. I mean, some people have they've suggested to me, or they've claimed, oh, luxury beliefs, this is just like a Trojan horse for conservative ideas or something. And I'm like, no, this to me, it's much more rooted in class, because where I grew up, there were a lot of working class Democrats in California that I grew up around, neighbors and family friends and so forth. They sort of died in the wool Democrats, but the way that they talk and speak and communicate, I'd be like, gender stereotypes, it's all on the table. Like there's no filter, and they would immediately get canceled. Like if they were to walk on a college campus and speak the way that they spoke, despite the fact that they've voted Democrat their whole lives. So I think this is like they would say things that would make like a college educated Republican blush. Right.
Yes.
Like the sort of unfiltered, off the cuff, like, just not worried about, offending this group or that group. Cause it's not, and it doesn't come from a place of malice or anything. That's just how people communicate, when you grow up that way. So it's, and I think it's becoming harder. The other element of luxury beliefs that I've discussed, is about how, it's harder to sort of learn what the beliefs are and how to appropriately and accurately communicate them as you sort of, if you want to achieve upward social mobility. And so all of these things, the right opinions and the way to express them, they create barriers for people who would like to escape from their circumstances. It's just so to me, this connects to the idea of standardized testing. There's a lot of universities are attempting to eliminate standardized testing, saying that they're prejudiced or something. But to me, if you're going to eliminate the tests and focus only on the essays, the essays, you have to be able to communicate in such a specific way to signal your family background and your values and your education and all of these things. It's much easier for a poor kid to go to the library or go online and brush up on how to take the SAT than it is to read the right books, the right op-eds, like constantly keep on top of the sort of sociopolitical fashions and trends and communicate them in the right way. Like sometimes I'll go back home and I'll ask, friends and stuff, like, do you know this term? I'm just wondering, like, has it trickled down yet?
Yeah,
like, so like
I understand that.
they know POC, but they don't know BIPOC yet. BIPOC hasn't reached them, but probably this time next year it will. And so it's always a little behind. And, if they were to write or to say, one term versus the other, they would immediately give themselves away as like, oh, you're behind the times. Like, you don't understand what you're supposed to say now.
That's really interesting, these barriers to entry. And I've seen a lot of writing about how standardized testing is one of the ways for anybody of any class to get ahead and to take that away, because there is a language. I'm old, by the media standards, and I joke about how I came online in like 2015 when I started writing for Playboy. And it was basically like I woke up from a blackout in the early aughts or the 90s, because I didn't go to college and I wasn't educated with all of these beliefs. And then I entered into a media system at 37 years old and had to learn an entirely new language. I knew I had never heard of internalized misogyny. I had never heard of so many of the things. It was such a steep learning curve, and it was basically me I was writing like a working class person in the 90s. I probably should have been writing for Maxim or something, and I was getting dragged every single week for saying that I didn't know you couldn't say real man. I didn't know that alpha male was a right wing trigger. I didn't know. I mean, there were so many things that I just kept stepping on rake after rake after rake. And I can't imagine what that's like if you're younger and come from a situation where you're not exposed to that, because it changes so fast too. So unless you're very online, how are you keeping up with this?
Yeah. And if you have a job or, live in an environment where you can't spend, hours a day on your laptop or scrolling through Twitter and social media, and it's you can't really do that. Yeah. If you're a kid who lives in a whatever single parent home, and your mom's working and you have to get a part-time job and you're taking care of younger siblings, and it's impossible for you to constantly keep up with, oh, now this is the new political slogan I'm supposed to believe in now, and this is what's acceptable, this is what's going to get me into college, versus actually learning like how to read and how to do math and all the sort of basic things that anybody could learn regardless of how much time they spend online.
When you joined the military, you were 17?
Yeah, I was 17, right after high school.
Okay. Is that how old you're allowed to join? I thought it was 18 for some reason.
So you can join when you're 17. That is the sort of bottom limit of age, but you have to get parent or guardian signature on consent, essentially. So when I was 17, I had to have my adoptive mother sign some documents. Took a bit of persuading. She was kind of reluctant for me to go, but she knew I was going to just go off when I was 18 anyway. And so, I was the youngest. I was the youngest one for a long time, like everywhere. When I first joined, it was the youngest. So it's pretty uncommon for 17-year-olds to join, but I was very much in a hurry to flee and get away from where I was living.
Tell me about that experience and how it changed you, shaped you, what inspired you to get into it. I feel like I've read a lot of your stuff and it's always like one line in your work, but it feels like something that's really important and pivotal in your life.
I mean, that was up to that point, that was the best decision I'd ever made. Not that I'd made that many great ones, but that was one of them. And so, I mean, what led up to it? I was just, kind of a troublemaker as a teenager. I barely passed high school, just barely. All my friends were like, all of us were on sort of bad trajectories. And I knew that if we were if I were to stay there with them after high school, things weren't going to get any better for us, or at least for me. And there were a couple of older guys I knew, older men. So my friend's father, I lived with him. My friend and his father, I lived with them for my senior year of high school. And his friend's dad had been in the Air Force, and he recommended it to me. And then one of my teachers in high school, my history teacher, he also suggested enlisting too. He had been in the Air Force, so just kind of happenstance, these two guys had happened to be in the Air Force, and they were like, they probably saw some like glimmer, some latent potential in me, but they realized I was just, not at all sort of interested in exploring it. But maybe if I was in the military, that would help to reveal it. So that was the decision that led me there. And it was the experience itself. I mean, I think that it did teach me the kinds of things you would expect a military enlistment to teach a young man, a young guy, just self-discipline and camaraderie and respect, and setting goals and fulfilling your duties and your obligations, all of those kinds of things, just sort of living in that sort of structure. And I think the other thing is, and this is like a little bit, this is something that I'd only realized in the last couple of years, which is that, so in the field of psychology, there's this idea called the young male syndrome, which is basically that, if you look throughout the lifespan of men, when they're the most likely to commit violent and aggressive acts, to engage in risk-taking behaviors or do drugs or drink and drive, all of these things that could potentially put their lives or others at risk, usually around 18, 19, 20 years old. That's right. Like when the risk peaks. And that's the young male syndrome. But when I was in the military, I was in the military during those years, during that sort of late teen, early 20s period. And one thing that the military does is basically prevents you from doing anything that could ruin your life. They make it very clear upfront, sort of what the expectations are of you and what the consequences and penalties will be for failing to uphold those expectations. So they make it very clear upfront, like if you fail a drug test, for example. So there's random drug tests. You never know, just randomly. Oh, time to go pee in a cup. Okay, just randomly, like almost like it's prison. And then if you fail, then it's very clear you're going to go to military prison. And I knew guys that this had happened to them. And so having that very tight link between actions and consequences was good for me. I think it's probably good in general for young people, but especially for me. And it prevented me from doing anything for those years that could have derailed me. And so anyway, my point is that, like, even if you don't learn anything at all, even if a young guy at least doesn't learn anything all during the military, that's still 4 years or 6 years that they spent. You know, maybe it doesn't set them up for success, but it prevents them from catastrophic failure. It prevents them from thwarting, a positive trajectory in their lives. And then by the time they reach their early 20s, every guy is going to be a little bit less stupid at 22 or 24 than he was at 18. And so you sort of mellow out, you sort of become a little bit more mature and self-reflective and all those kinds of things. And so I like to believe that, I took all of these great lessons and maybe I did, but I also think that it was just like, here's a few years of, I'm just going to press fast forward on the most sort of volatile and risky years of your life where you can't actually act on any of those impulses. Because I still had them, but I just knew I couldn't do anything. And sometimes I still did. I just did it less often because of the possibility of getting into trouble because of them. So I think those are the two sort of facets of how I think it helped me.
It seems like it channels a lot of that young male energy as well. So not only does it just take you out of the game of being able to self-destruct completely, and people still do within that system, but I do think it lowers the chance of that happening. It also seems like it channels it. You're still doing, working out and I think you have, firearm training and all the boy stuff.
Yeah. No, that's right. Yeah. There's fitness tests. Yeah. You have to, regularly qualify, with different weapons and all those kinds of things. It's really, it's cool. It's, this sort of like, this, I don't know, masculine thing or whatever. That's appealing. And yeah, it does. I think it does channel it. And the other thing is, like, the hours are so long and so brutal that, like, you're almost too tired to do anything. Like,
they wear you out.
There's sometimes, like when I was deployed, we'd work 16 hours a day, 6 days, sometimes 7 days a week. And you're just too tired to do anything. And it's, I think there is like, there probably is like a need, like a mission need for that. Like that is required. But I also sometimes suspected secretly that, like, they're making us work this much so that we can't screw around and get into trouble because of our, and so yeah, I think that's definitely just the taking up a lot of your time is a big factor too.
Did it give you to some level of self-confidence? Did you feel at all that you maybe got from just even completing things and meeting goals that you didn't have a belief in yourself, or am I just assuming something?
Probably, yeah. I mean, I think just doing hard things and, you do enough hard things. And I think naturally your self-confidence grows. And there was like regular feedback too. There's regular performance reports, there are regular fitness tests. Like it's extremely structured. I mean, the military has sort of perfected, this sort of hierarchical structure of, like, here's how you advance in rank. Here are the expectations set of you. And if you fail to meet expectations, they make it clear for how you can improve or what you've done wrong. And yeah, it's all, I think all of that stuff was very helpful. I mean, it's almost, this probably isn't like a great analogy, but there is, like, it almost reminds me of like a video game where, in a game, here's what you have to do to level up, here's how you advance. And the military, like, it's almost like, if you do X, Y will happen, and you do that enough times, and it's clear how you, make it to the next rank, or how you obtain this next position and do well, and all these kind. It's kind of, you can, almost gamify some aspects of it for how to advance. Whereas outside of that struggle, just like, the civilian world, everyday reality, it's like, there's all these questions about, how do I do well in my life? How do I do well in the world? Questions of identity too. The military kind of strips you of your identity, which is kind of a double-edged sword. I mean, on the one hand, it's, I think it was helpful for me, like later, like for the guys, they shave your head, put you all in the same uniform and call you by your last name. And you just like, who you were before doesn't matter anymore. And so you're immediately sort of bonded into this new group. But then that becomes your identity and so on. But then if you go to college, or in the case of my friends, if you just sort of stay where you are and sort of flounder in community college or something, or work menial jobs, there are these questions like, who am I? Or maybe you're trying to run away from those questions and, get involved in drugs or violence or risky behaviors or whatever. Or in the case of, I think, a lot of college students, they get involved in politics or activism or something, because that can become an identity for you.
Yes.
And so, it sort of channels those impulses.
There's a lot of things that I identify with when you speak, mostly that feeling of being lost. And I was one of those people who went to community college and floundered and felt quite lost, and even in high school, because I was lost, my identity became more about partying. And when there isn't a stable family situation, no one's really watching you. You end up kind of raising yourself, and obviously you're not going to do a great job if you're a teenager trying to raise yourself. And
Right.
You end up making very questionable decisions. In my case, I did, at least, not everybody. And I wish sometimes, I remember being in my youth wishing that I was a man so that I could join the military. I know that I could have as a woman, but it seemed like it was more accessible to men. And a lot of my family members, it just seemed like if you didn't know what you were going to do, that was a kind of acceptable choice to make. It wasn't necessarily in my family. So it wasn't really something I even considered. But looking back, I think something like that probably would have saved me a lot of grief and pain in my life.
Yeah. I mean, it's that's, I think that there's probably that sort of gender stereotype and stuff. I mean, there are women in the military. There were a lot
Yeah,
of
definitely.
great people I knew who, in some cases, they outperformed the men in certain kinds of jobs, at least. And so, but it's the sort of the feeling of being lost. I mean, I was, for whatever reason, I was able to sort of have, it wasn't, I don't even know if it was an explicit thought really. But it was just this feeling, when I was 16, 17 years old, of just like, I just have this feeling something bad's going to happen if I stay here. Looking around, seeing like the guys that my coworkers at the restaurant, and realizing like, if, because some of them were older than me, they were guys in their late 20s, and they were, I thought of them as cool, right? Because they would buy beer for us, and like they'd, sometimes hook us up with weed or with pills or whatever. And like, they would, they'd come party with us, but there was still like some part of me, and would really sort of tip me off was when I would see, like the girls' reaction to them, right? Like the 15, 16, 17-year-old girls, like they were much more like kind of weirded out by these older guys who'd hang out and like try to buy beer and stuff. Like they, like, young boys were just like, whatever, like, he's hooking us up with beer, who cares? But the girls could, I thought like, I don't want to be looked at like that someday. Like that just, that's just not what I wanted for my life. And so, the military was just like a very quick way to just like press the eject button and just like get out of there.
And did you do 4 years or 6?
I did 8 years.
Oh, 8 years.
It took a
Wow.
long time, and I needed it. Like it took 8 years for me to figure out like how to get my life on track. So I joined when I was 17 and left when I was 25.
Wow. And what was it like going from that to Yale?
It was a strange experience. I mean, it was Yeah, I mean, I was definitely. I mean, it's so 25 doesn't sound like. I mean, it's clearly older than 18, but it doesn't sound like super old. But I felt old. Like the I've made this joke before that like I felt like the longer I was in college, the younger I felt.
Right.
Simply because the amount of like temporal distance I put between myself and my life in the military. Because after 8 years, like they're very quickly like, especially I did well in the test, I got promoted fast and everything, and was relatively successful. And so I was like, I was responsible for several people underneath me, and 25 years old, and then I get to college and I'm a 25-year-old college student, and suddenly like, yeah, it was like I almost felt like I was in high school again, with just like
Mm,
classes and kids, and they had no responsibilities, just a lot of drinking and partying. And I mean, again, they weren't these students, they were impressive in many ways. I mean, a lot of them had trained their whole lives to go to a place like that. They were extremely sharp, hardworking, all those kinds of things. But there was this sort of immaturity, even compared to my high school friends. I sensed this kind of immaturity because they had had so little contact with the real world. None of
mhm.
them. I don't think I had ever met a single student there who'd had like a part-time job in high school, or had to like take care of a younger sibling because their
Right.
parents were, neglectful or something like that. And so, yeah, there was this like, lack of development that I noticed among them. Um, Even things like driving, like most of them have their driver's licenses, but they get their license, then they just take Ubers forever. And
Wow.
then I'd get into a car with one of them, and like maybe I'd rent a car with a couple of friends, and like one of them would try to drive, and like clearly they were like shaking, like fear afraid, because they hadn't driven in so long. And I remember like, I had to drive into work every day. I had like hour-long commutes. Like I was just
Yeah.
driving. Like when you're an adult, especially if you don't grow up in like New York or something, you just drive everywhere.
Yeah,
And
everywhere.
these kids just don't. And so, yeah, that was like little experiences like that I found funny. Yeah, the interactions I had, the sort of the class and political stuff, like I remember I heard this word once. I was for a couple of months, my first semester, I wrote for this humor magazine on campus, and I think it was my first or second brainstorming session. We were brainstorming headlines for the next issue, and the theme of the issue was puberty. And I came up with this, it was just a brainstorming session. I came up with this headline like, "Area male discovers a porn gold mine in front right pocket." And the editor, who was like a junior or senior, he looks at me and he raises an eyebrow, and he's like, "Well, why?" And he's like, "Okay, why does it have to be gendered? Gendered with the ed at the end, gendered." And I looked at him and I was like, I had no idea what that meant, and I was too embarrassed to even ask. I'm just like thinking to myself, I'm like, "Oh, I don't know." That's all I said, and I remember like thinking to myself, like, what does that word mean, gendered? I'd heard the word gender before, but never gendered.
Right.
And then later I would realize, like, oh, it's because I said area male, and so I used gendered language.
Oh, wow.
And I guess I wonder if it would have been more acceptable if I had said area female. I don't know what would have been more acceptable, but small things like that happened, on a fairly regular basis, especially my first semester, that first year, and then gradually I came to understand like all of the little things that people cared about. Things like keeping up with the news was another one that was kind of interesting for me. So when I was growing up in Red Bluff, California, my mom and her partner, they subscribed to the local newspaper. They have it delivered to the front porch. But we couldn't afford cable, so we didn't like watch Fox or MSNBC or any of these shows.
Mhm.
And the news and like being informed was never a part of my life. But then I get to college, and like everywhere I'm there, it's like, it's good to be informed, it's good to keep up with the news, keep up with the headlines, or like people would talk about it like, "Oh, did you see what so and so wrote in the op-ed of the New York Times, or this piece in the Atlantic?" And I'm like, I've never read really any
Any of
of
them.
these. So I started to realize like, oh, like part of being a part of this like community, the educated classes, you have to like have some cursory understanding of what people are talking about, what the chattering class cares about, what the, I guess nowadays we would call it the current thing. What's
Right.
the current thing?
Current
And
thingism.
yeah, and back then I just had no. I'm just like, oh, I people would look at me like I was crazy, like, "Oh, did you read this or did you hear?" I'm like, "No," and they're like, "What? How could you not know?" I'm like, it's just this whole idea of being informed. Back when my life was relatively more difficult, being informed wasn't like important, but once my life had become more secure and my future had become just sort of brighter than it had ever been, suddenly I had to like be informed. It became this important thing, and really gradually I came to believe that being informed, I mean, it's just a maybe it's just a class signifier. It's just a way
Yeah.
for you to sort of show off your worldliness and, you know, your sophistication, especially for people who are informed, but then they don't do anything with that information other than talk about it.
Yeah, that's funny. I have this very satirical news show, Dumpster Fire, and we constantly are like, we are not a news show because we just make fun of it. We sometimes we'll cover a headline and the group of us who does it, I'm like, did anyone read the article? And none of us will have actually like read the article. And I'm like, see, you guys, here we are consuming news like the average person and trying to make sense of it for you. We are not a news show. And people are constantly like, I get all my news from you.
That's
because
great.
they're just working people who are just, they're like, I never would have heard of any of this stuff if it wasn't, because we're making fun of all of the stuff that you and I are kind of talking about, these luxury beliefs and how they get distilled into the culture. And I never knew. I experienced the same thing coming out from waiting tables. I didn't have time to pay attention to that. And I didn't know when I stumbled particularly into the culture wars. And then I remember someone was like, it's so adorable how you call it the National Review. Because I didn't, it's National Review. I didn't know. I knew nothing about the kind of academic left-wing ideology that everybody absorbs. I also knew nothing about conservative media, which was like a whole other world. I was just a run-of-the-mill lib trying to make ends meet.
Yeah. That's interesting. As you say, National Review, like, yeah, how would I don't even know what I would call it actually. National Review or the National Review. Yeah.
Yeah, it was just someone was like, I know you're not faking your lack of knowledge about conservative media. I just knew nothing about it. And it's funny to me the current thingism, and now I'm in this space and I still, my siblings and family members and most of the people I know, they pay attention, but they're not in it. You know, they're not paying. I don't know that the average person is paying as close attention as you have to when you're in academia or when you're in the media or this chattering class, which is weird because I still don't feel, even though this is what I do, I still don't feel like I'm a part of this conversation.
Yeah, well, there's a great book that really, I mean, it was really illuminating for me when I first, I read it like the summer before I started college. I found it on some like college board forum or something. It was some other like first year student or first generation college student who posted a link to it or something about it, saying it really helped them to like integrate into the campus. It was called Class, A Guide Through the American Status System, by this guy, Paul Fussell. And it was written in the 1980s, so it's slightly outdated, but generally speaking, the observations are pretty spot on about the sort of different classes in America and what they value and what they consider to be, high status and respectful and worthy of esteem. But one thing that he pointed out in that book is that the class, at least in the American system, we like to believe that we're egalitarian and anyone can be any class they want if you just work hard enough and so on. And it's true, you can make as much money as you want, but in terms of your class goes beyond money. It even goes beyond education. And really the class that you're born into is kind of the one that you'll always be. It's possible for your children to transcend it. Like if your children are born in, if you're wealthy, if you're like a self-made millionaire or something, your children are born into it. They can grow up to actually be upper middle or upper class, but you never will be. And I remember reading that, and at first I was like slightly offended. Like what? Like why? This is because it's sort of that offends that American belief in unlimited sort of bootstrap social mobility. But then the longer I've I guess been sort of a part of this new group of people, the more I realize it's probably true that to some extent I'll always feel more comfortable like going to a food truck or like a taco stand in California than like going to like a, you know, a 3-course dinner with like 4 different spoons and, you know, like the waiter's wearing a white tie or something. Like, it's just, I always feel just a little bit uncomfortable
Uh-huh.
there. You know, so, and I know I've tried, like, I've even done things like I've taken a wine class just to like learn how to pronounce the wines. And like the thing that I got the most out of that was just how to talk about wine without really knowing, like, I still don't know how to determine quality, but I know like the way that you're supposed to talk about it, you know, like, oh, this has a, you know, strong nose, or talk about like, you know, graham cracker
The
dust and earthy
undertones.
tones and
Yeah.
all these things. Like, okay, so these are the words you're supposed to use, but I don't know how they correspond to the actual wine itself. I still can't make that connection.
I was thinking about what you were saying about that immaturity, because I basically dropped out of college at 19. Well, I ended up in rehab, and then I just didn't go back right away. And I was supporting myself through various means and just out in Los Angeles, kind of hustling and taking jobs, whatever I could do. And then all of my friends who went to college graduated, and I felt like they were children. They didn't know how to rent. They didn't know anything about car insurance. They didn't, that all those basic things that you learn when you're taking care of yourself. I was like, what did you learn in college? How are you not able to function as an adult in this world right now? But then they had their own kind of, now I need to become an adult learning curve. But I was, for 4 years at least, you're really not. You're kind of, you get to be very much still. It's like having all of the freedom of being an adult and none of the responsibility. It really, I never had that time in my life.
Yeah, it's especially, yeah, for people who like go away to college, like residential colleges and stuff. Like, this is like an extension of high school, but with even more freedom and even less oversight. And yeah, this term, I hate this term, adulting. You know,
I know, I hate it too.
you know, like how to pay rent, how to, you know, do your taxes and all these things. And so my girlfriend has a nice term. She calls it life admin. And I'm like, okay, life admin is, you know, I kind of like, that sounds better than adulting, you know, just the sort of like the drudgery of being an adult. But yeah, this word adulting, I just despise it.
I call it boring grown-up stuff. I still call it that.
Good,
I'm
good,
44 years old, and I'm like, Monday's admin day. It's a boring admin Monday. Like, it's always just boring grown-up stuff, but it still feels that way to me, even though I've been doing it for so long. Yeah, it's just,
yeah, it's dull, but it's just part of it.
It's part of it. Yeah. As you've written your memoir, and you know, your upbringing was very volatile, and it sounds like you write a lot about instability, which I really appreciate, because I think that is at my core. It still affects me. I was so young when we were moving and all of these things that you have no idea how it's really affecting your psyche. And even with therapy and all the stuff, I still see how it pops up when I'm in different situations. Yeah. What have you learned from writing your memoir, and how have you kind of processed some of, I really hate the overuse of the word trauma, but it does sound like you had a pretty traumatic childhood.
Yeah, I mean, it was hard to write that book. So I wrote it mostly during so it was a lockdown book, a COVID book, where you know, I'd spend so during that period, you know, I'd write in like the mornings and afternoons, and then I was taking naps during the writing process. And I'd never taken naps before. I'd never been a nap person. And at first, you know, the first few months, I was just attributing it to, like, I don't know, maybe like a low level depression or something from the lockdowns from COVID. You know, the world, you know, everyone was just sort of freaking out, and things had changed so fast. And it was just like a bleak period. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And then later I came to realize, like, I don't think that was it. I think I was misattributing that sort of feeling of like mental and psychological exhaustion to COVID or the lockdowns or something, when really it was writing about my life. Like, that was sort of so draining that I had to sleep in the afternoon to recover from it. So yeah, it was tough. It was tough writing it. I mean, I would say that if I had known in advance what it was going to be like to write it, I probably wouldn't have done it.
Yeah.
So in a way, I'm I'm almost glad I didn't know what it was going to be like to do it. Because I'm glad I did it. I'm glad it's done. I'm glad that like the story's there, and it'll be, eventually it'll be available for anyone to read. But yeah, it was hard to sort of relive and revisit all of those things. And part of the experience, I was catching up with friends from high school. I was talking to my sister. I was talking to my mom. All these things, like trying to reignite all of these old memories. And I'd have these experiences where I'd be sleeping, and then like I'd bolt awake at like 2 or 3 a.m. because I would like during my, while I was asleep, suddenly a memory would occur to me that I hadn't thought about in years. And I'd like jump to my computer and I gotta write this down before I forget it. And there were like, multiple times like that. It was tough. It was tough to write. But as far as like the process of the book itself, I mean, it was, not as difficult as actually living through it, but surprisingly close. I mean,
Yeah.
I was surprised at how fresh some of the feelings still were from it. That I thought like, oh, I can just sort of get it down now. But no, like if you want to write something good, like something personal, and you're a writer too, this. Like if you really want to sort of capture the feelings that you have in the moment, you have to sort of revisit it and re-feel them to get it down on paper. And yeah, I generally am not like a big fan of personal writing, which is another reason it was so hard for me to do this. And I'll say, yeah, I mean, I wrote a PhD thesis alongside it, and my PhD was much easier than writing the book, because that intellectual kind of writing, it just comes from a different part of the brain, right? For me, it's less exhausting than that emotional part. That I'm just not as used to exploring.
Have you been in therapy or anything like that? Do you find those things beneficial?
Yeah. So yeah, it was in the book. I discuss some of those
Okay.
experiences. So, but
Cool.
yeah, we should definitely talk more.
Yeah.
on another episode. But
I
yeah,
mean,
I did have those. I did have to get some outside help at one point.
Yeah. I find your story just so compelling, and you're somebody that I turn to because I trust your perspective. It's grounded in something different than just I've been reading about these folks over there in books, it's grounded in reality. And so I will say I turn to you a lot to look when I'm not sure how I'm feeling about something, or I'm looking for different insight. I find yours to be very astute, and it's not usually running with the herd. I feel like you have just a really original perspective, and it's refreshing in the space that we're in because you've lived so much life. And that seems to be lacking a lot of the time in the kind of laptop class that writes about a lot of these issues.
Yeah, there aren't a lot of people who are who work in media, or who write, or who podcast and all these things, who have the kinds of experiences that I've had, or that you've had. Just people who didn't grow up. It'd be, I guess, like one differentiator for me about like what kind of class you grew up in is, when you were in high school, were you expected to go to college or not? And that to me is like a very clear sort of distinction between sort of working or lower middle class versus middle or upper middle. And almost everyone who sort of talks and writes and blabs for a living, they mostly have grown up in one kind of reality, a relatively comfortable reality. And yeah, I think it's rare, and it's surprisingly rare to find people, and somehow it's becoming rarer. I don't know why that might be, but it just seems to be becoming rarer to find people from outside of that bubble who can communicate about these issues. And this is one thing that I like about that with Substack and with YouTube, and there are all these other platforms now where you don't have to rely on gatekeepers to find people, but then it's just a matter of sort of sifting through and finding quality voices.
Yeah, I was definitely expected to go to college, although I feel like the expectation was there, but then the environment was not provided, even though the expectation might have been there. And then there was divorce, and everything changed after that. And so I was definitely middle to upper class, but then my life became very working class because I just all of our circumstances changed, and I was really trying to make my own way, and I chose a much harder path. I decided I wanted to be a writer and go into the arts, and everybody was like, good luck.
Yeah.
And I made a lot of mistakes, and I think that I look at that fork in the road and I think of how much of a douchebag I would probably be if I didn't have, I suffered a lot, but I really wonder what kind of person I would have turned out to be if I just, continued on that path with no interruption. I'm not sure I would really like the person that I am. I certainly know that the person that I am right now would probably hate that person.
Yeah. This is one of those things I try to keep in mind, try to be relatively charitable when I criticize, some of these trends from people who grew up rich or relatively affluent, that if I had grown up like that, maybe, I'd probably be closer to them than I would want to be, or would be willing to admit. But yeah, I think that story is interesting, though. Like I wish there were more stories like that, because especially in America, we love these sort of these rags to riches kind of stories of people who grew up poor and then like found success in their lives. But I'm also interested in the sort of like how family instability can affect people in the other direction, where maybe you actually start out like relatively well off, middle or upper middle, and then like you said, like maybe there's divorce or other kinds of factors involved that can lead people to actually slip down for a bit, and what that might look like. Because I think there's just this belief that upward mobility is impossible, and rich people are the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, this kind of thing, when actually I've met and interacted with a few people who their families were actually pretty well off, and then oftentimes addiction is involved or something like that.
Yep.
And then people lose their fortune, and then their kids are sort of downwardly mobile, and those stories don't get told very often.
Yeah, it's something my husband and I talk a lot about, because I think we came from a similar background, and there is a class distinction in that. I know a lot of very wealthy kids, as I'm sure you do, going to Yale, but that I know a lot of, and you can't really, there was such a huge cushion. No matter how much they messed up, they could be absolute degenerates, and there was still something that would catch them. It didn't matter. They had so much money, and in that case, a lot of the time, the only thing that really stops them is some kind of addiction, they're where they just can't get out of that spiral. But in terms of making mistakes there, if you're from the kind of uber rich, then you can still make those bad decisions like I made and not really suffer. You can easily kind of course correct. It will be corrected for you in what I've seen or experienced. But I think when you're middle upper class and make these kinds of mistakes, like my husband and I both met in recovery, and he was working at Trader Joe's. I had been waiting tables not too long before we met. We both had been working class for decades at that point. And it started really for both of us, the more we talk, when our parents got divorced, and then our trajectory just kind of changed. So that focus that you have on instability, more than even class, because I think it's true. I know a lot of really wealthy people who, when their parents got divorced, that completely destabilized them more than, and they had a lot of money. Yeah. And I know a lot of really poor people who have great parents who are together and focus on them, and they have an inner core of stability and self-confidence and just sense of knowing their place and feeling secure than I had. And a lot of people I know. So that really focus that you have is something that I'm looking forward to reading more about and hearing from you. And I like how you bring in a lot of the actual data that you find that supports this.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the, there's so many interesting findings around instability. That it was a surprising discovery for me. looking at a lot of the research in developmental and evolutionary psychology, that they make this distinction between childhood harshness and childhood instability. And harshness is essentially your parental income, the family, socioeconomic status, how much money your parents or your family had growing up. But instability, it's like the number of times you relocated as a kid, whether your parents were divorced, whether you're raised by a single parent, how many people moved in and out of your family home, how much sort of day-to-day turmoil there was, how much could you, expect to be predictable in your home life. It was like the frequency of different jobs that your parents had. Was there sort of like this sort of uncertainty, this question mark hanging over their employment and where they were going to work next. So all of these kinds of things are involved in instability, and study after study finds that instability is a far stronger predictor of all kinds of life outcomes, detrimental life outcomes, than childhood poverty.
Wow.
So, like whether it comes to future likelihood of addiction, criminality, divorce, likelihood of completing high school, completing college, obtaining gainful employment, instability. It seems like sort of living in a disorderly environment has a far stronger effect than being poor. And yeah, I've seen the same thing. I've seen rich kids who have parents who are alcoholics or addicted to drugs or get divorced or just sort of neglectful, relatively just uncaring. And a lot of these kids have a lot of problems. But then I see like a lot of poor kids who, especially from like immigrant families, they have like
Yes.
these sort of family values, they stay together, and despite having relatively little in the way of money or material resources, they set their kids up to go off to college, and they do relatively well. And yeah, they aren't suffering from the same kinds of afflictions that like the rich people with the instability had. I mean, there was a study that looked directly at this and found that rich kids who grew up in unstable families are much more likely to abuse drugs than poor kids who are raised in stable families.
Wow. I
And
believe
so
that.
yeah, it makes sense, right? Like and yet like a lot of the sort of most influential members of society will focus on money rather than stability.
There's so much neglect, and that's where I try to be charitable too. Is there's so much neglect among the wealthy and their children. It's crazy. It's just kind of hidden neglect, It's passed off, but I've seen the effects of that with a lot of friends of mine. Yeah, it's really fascinating. I love all of your work, and I definitely want to have you back on when your book comes out and dig more into your story. This has been fantastic. What I ask the same questions at the end of my podcast. What's your biggest defect of character?
I mean, I want to say, it's a weird thing to say, but I consider myself pretty lazy. And the reason why I work so hard is because I'm afraid of letting it take over me. I was really lazy as a teenager.
Mm-hmm.
And, I worked and stuff, but that was just because I had to, I
Yeah.
had to work, but I neglected my studies, all of that stuff. And then later, like I realized, like, if I worry that if I take like time off from work, then I'll fall into this cycle of like not working anymore. And so I force myself to work almost every day, like 7 days a week.
Wow.
6 days a week.
Yeah.
And so I wish that I like was naturally hardworking, or I didn't feel like this inner anxiety about like, oh, if I stop working, then I'm just going to be like a lazy person forever. So I don't know if it makes sense though. You know what I mean? It's like an internal
makes sense.
feeling of laziness. Okay.
Well,
Good.
my friend Carol Roth was saying the other day, she's like, I'm lazy. She said that. I was like, she's written so many, she's like the opposite of lazy, but she said something that really struck me. She said she considers laziness when it comes to things she doesn't want to do. And she loves working. She's like, I love working. It's not hard for me to work. And she said, so she's like, so I don't consider myself, that's not something that's hard for me to do that I don't want to do. She's like, when it comes to things that I don't want to do, I'm so lazy. And I was like, I've never heard that differentiation, and it just blew my mind.
That's so useful. Man, okay, but I can never talk to my girlfriend about this one because she'll suddenly understand. Because
She'll be like,
when
yeah,
it comes to
you're lazy.
like planning, I'm terrible at planning. But I'd rather work. I'd rather work. And so that's okay. Interesting.
That's funny.
Yeah. Okay.
And what's your
I
biggest,
feel lazy. And what's okay? Yeah.
what's your biggest asset?
Biggest asset. I'm pretty willing to speak with anyone I disagree with. Like regardless of politics or social issues or anything. I mean, I'm willing to speak with just about anyone, even if I know in advance we'll probably disagree, and like trying to find points of agreement. So maybe that might be an asset, is just sort of willingness to connect with people and meet them where they are.
That's awesome. I think you're very good at that too. Where can we find you and all of your work? I actually think your website, by the way, is one of the most helpful websites I've ever seen for somebody. It's very clear. I like how you have your little starter pack of what to read.
Okay.
And I was just looking at all of your stuff, and I mean, I read your stuff anyway, but then I was like, oh, I wonder what kind of things he has to find him. But I was inspired by your website. I'm like, I really should do something like this where it makes it very easy to be like, here's where I've appeared recently. Here's my most read articles.
Yeah, I need to update
I find that very helpful.
Yeah. So this goes back to my like laziness / procrastination. Like I haven't updated my website in probably like a year. So I need to go back and see, like, are these still my most read? I don't even most of my stuff. So speaking of this, so most of my stuff now is on Substack. And so probably better to visit Substack now. So robkhenderson.substack.com is where like all my latest writing and stuff is. And then Twitter at Rob K. Henderson. And then hopefully by the time this is out, I'll have gotten around to updating my website.
It's very I mean, it was helpful it's very helpful, even if it's like a very quick overview. I think I need to do something like that because I am all over the place.
It's good to have
another one of my
centralized
defects of characters, disorganization. Well, this has been a joy. You are welcome back anytime you want to come talk about anything, and please come back when we're trying to promote and sell your memoir, which I can't wait to read. And everybody should go read your Substack and follow you and keep up with you.
All right. Yeah, this has been great. I'd love to come back. Thanks, Bridget.
It's time for the weekly check-in with Bridget and cousin Maggie. All right.
Hello. Bridget just had a sneezing fit, so she might have another one.
No, it's so weird. It's like I felt something get up my nose and make me have an allergy attack. Which is very rare for me here in California, but I should probably get used to it in Texas.
Well, apparently it's allergy season's been terrible here because of all the rain. So
it's never going to stop raining now.
Nope.
I prayed for rain, everyone. This was the year. I said, dear God, rain gods, we need rain because of the drought. Please give us rain. And it never stopped raining.
And she got her answer. She's a powerful witch.
Yes, I am, folks. No one believed me.
No one ever believes you about shit like this.
Oh, I have so many thoughts. So many
Such
thoughts.
as?
Well, what we were talking about on our walk, I had two friends who were some of my best friends.
Yeah.
I mean,
for a long time.
Truly, yeah. For 5 to 7 year stints, I would say. These people were regularly in my life, men. And they weren't lovers. They were just friends. And in the past week, I've had to reach out to them one posted that he had a baby or his whatever. I don't even know if it's his girlfriend or wife. Had a baby. And so I congratulated him and sent a picture of my daughter. And then he was like, who's this? Like, my child. And then my other friend had to reach out for some information about how to party if you're 22. And same thing. He's like, how you doing? And I sent a picture and he was like, who's this? Like, my child. But it made me realize that, the parasocial relationship I have with my audience, they know me better than these people do who are like my best friends at one point in my life.
Right. And I was pointing out, you don't really post about that. Like, you weren't like, I'm pregnant on social media, any of it.
Maybe they just thought I got fat. It also made me realize just how in everybody's like own world they are.
Yeah.
Because unless you're consuming my content, I guess you really wouldn't know. It's not like I'm posting about it.
Right.
But even some of the pictures I posted from the dumpster fires, I look like I'm big.
Yeah. But still, if they didn't see them at that exact time,
Yeah.
they could have just missed them.
Shows me who's out there not watching my content. I'll tell you that.
Most of our family,
Most
thank God.
of our friends, thank God. Yeah, it was interesting for me to realize that someone listening to this right now knows us better
Right.
Than-
More about our daily lives
than most of our family and actual friends.
Right.
But what does that say?
I have no idea.
What does that say? What does it mean? And I've had such crazy conversations, and they're all mishmashing in my mind. Upcoming guests on Walk-Ins Welcome, one of whom was Siddharth Kara, who is the Cobalt Red author and journalist. And the other was today, I'm going to butcher her name.
Agnestia.
Yeah, it's
How many times did that get you?
Only once it took me, but now I can't remember it
Yeah.
right now. So we were talking, and she's pro AI and pro technology, and that was an interesting conversation. An artist, so we were talking about kind of soul and technology and art, which is one of my favorite topics, and media, and how people were. But I don't know. It's all melding in my mind.
Yeah.
There will be a cost for the technological revolution, and a lot of it is just that we're going to pillage the freaking Congo
Again.
Yeah, that's the other thing I want to write. There are just so many things I want to write about. I just want to get settled so I can get back to work.
Writing.
Because I'm working, but I'm like barely holding on.
Right. And once the house stuff is done and we're moved and all that stuff, I feel like you'll have more time.
I hope so, but maybe not. Maybe then I'll just be running after my increasingly mobile child. So yeah. I just have a lot of thoughts about all of these things. The AI is so nuts. Those pictures of Trump that went viral.
Oh, yeah.
Of him getting arrested, and people actually thought it was real. I'm like,
we're in trouble.
Yeah, we're in trouble. Because how can you be that dumb? But people are.
But eventually it will be really difficult to tell what's real and what's not.
And even somebody in my mentions when I was talking about this today was saying there's software that can supposedly tell if an image has been altered by AI, and even that is easy to fool.
I know. It's so weird when you sit and think about all the ways in which we're screwed as humans.
She was so optimistic. She's like, we're resilient. You can't get rid of us. And I was laughing. I'm like, the dinosaurs lasted like 10 times longer than we've been around.
Many more than 10 times. They lasted for like 100 million years or something crazy. We'll be lucky if we get to 1 million. I highly doubt we will.
Well, no, we've been around. They think that now the oldest human is around 1 million years,
I thought
right?
it was like 250,000.
I feel like this has been changing.
Sapiens versus, any other kind
the
of
pre-human
homos. Yes.
Any of those other homos.
But it might be like 300. I really don't think like Homo sapiens are 1 million years old.
Oh, maybe. I feel like I read something that they just found something that upended this whole timeline, but maybe not.
Possibly. I haven't seen that.
I don't know. Anyway, I feel like that's a bold proclamation considering how very young we are. And we're already on the verge of self-destructing in like 10 different ways. I was asking her, why do we think if she's like, oh, they're like our little sidekicks that can just help us be more efficient. Because she does art with her robot dog from Boston Dynamics, which is pretty cool. But she's like, they can just help us with our, they can help us be more efficient. I'm like, yeah, and I've always been saying this, at what point do they realize we are in the way of efficiency?
Right.
Humans are nonsensical, inefficient. We don't make sense at all.
Yeah.
Nothing we do makes sense. Any anyone who studies behavioral economics can see how completely irrational and dumb we are about almost everything.
And how like hypocritical our actions are to survival, for one.
Yeah. Well, we kill ourselves. So there's the first point.
All the time. And slow means... but
and
just
slow
like
in long ways
it's
and
slow
immediately.
and long and immediately, but like you can be killing yourself, by smoking for 20 years.
Yeah, or collectively by creating AI and helping it learn. But then she was like, some of the things do concern me, like the fact that if they're learning about humans from, what did she say? It was such a good analogy. If they're learning about humans from the internet, that's like everyone road rage all the time.
Yeah.
It's everyone's road rage self.
Yeah.
Like, she's like, other than dating apps, then they're more beautiful and more educated and more. I'm like, so they're just going to think we're a bunch of beautiful sociopaths.
But there's still a bunch that's fucked up on dating apps too. And like the people who are just kind of not on computers or on the internet very much, who are just kind of living their daily lives and being like, this is good. Yeah, none of that gets absorbed by the...
Like you, the yous.
Yeah.
The voices of reason. They're not online.
I'm sure there are plenty online.
I've been thinking about this in relation to Twitter because I've been just more and more... I just am over it. And I'm not sure how to reconcile that with my career path.
Well, it's almost easier now that Twitter's essentially stopped working.
That's
in a lot
true.
of ways.
There's no function for me.
Where you're like, this isn't being blasted out to the people I want it to be blasted out to. People
So
aren't
it's the
finding me like this anymore. Like, it's just not working.
Yeah, that's true. It actually probably is a good... That's true. It's partially because it's not literally not working or functioning the way it used to. So what's the point even?
Right, so you're sitting there being like, why am I doing this if I'm not
I can't even justify it for work.
Right.
I used to be able to lie to myself and justify it, and now it just feels
That
icky.
wasn't lying to yourself.
Well,
like,
no, it's
there were
true.
times, especially in the beginning, where when you were really growing, where I'd get kind of frustrated by how often you would be on Twitter, like even in the middle of a conversation or whatever. And then I'd just be like, she's working. She's actually working right now because she's growing the audience and expanding.
Yeah, it doesn't feel that way anymore.
No, because everyone seems to be having the same problem. Twitter is broken. They're not growing. Their tweets aren't seen by the people who usually saw them.
I should move to Instagram or somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you really should.
And I don't want anything that anyone on there has, other than Joe Rogan, who posts and ghosts and isn't there.
Mm-hmm.
But people who are there regularly, I really have to ask myself. It's like going to an AA meeting. You're like, we're all fucked up because we're here and we're the top 1% of people who are creating content on this mental ward.
Right.
But there are always people at AA where you're like, oh, that person seems to be really connected to God, or that person has what I want. Whether not, and it's usually not something,
but it's like
material.
Something good about the way they're living their life.
Yeah. And I was like, there's not a single person here that has anything that I want.
Uh-huh.
Because everyone seems so mad, and I'm sure it's their internet persona, but I don't want to partake in that either.
Yeah.
I don't want to be one of those people where you're like, I don't want that. Nobody seems happy on that app.
Yeah.
I'm pretty happy. I don't.
Yeah. And
maybe that's why I belong on
reality.
Instagram.
Yeah.
Maybe Instagram is for the
you should
happy people.
Pivot and focus more on that, because it's also a platform that works in terms of like growing your audience.
Kind of, although they'll argue that it doesn't anymore.
Well, but still, it's better than Twitter is right now.
It's because everyone's pivoting to Reels. So Instagram and YouTube are rewarding people who are making Reels because they're trying to compete with TikTok.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess that's something we're going to have to figure out how to do.
I feel like I would be good at Reels if I could get into it.
Yeah. If you could make them fun for yourself.
They might be easier. I don't know. But then I was thinking about the Cobalt Red guy and how bad I feel knowing what I know about it and being a part of this, unwillingly a part. I mean, willingly, I'm making a choice, but how can I have my business and function without all of this technology?
Right.
And he and I were having this conversation, and he's like, this is one way to having this conversation, spreading the message. I'm like, yeah, but then there's nothing you can do, so it's even worse.
Right.
But I do think one thing I can do that I've been thinking a lot about is not use the technology to bitch about M&Ms or whatever. Just
Right.
It's so stupid. I'm like, this is how we're using this. Not to liberate the people who are digging out the freaking cobalt for us.
Yeah.
We're gonna use this to yell at each other about the M&M character wearing boots. Are you fucking kidding me?
It does. It's so ridiculous.
They're children and minds.
Yeah, giving you the luxury of bitching about M&M boots.
It makes me crazy. That shit keeps me up at night.
Yeah.
It makes me insane.
Yeah. Huh.
And maybe I'll just end up doing what this guy did, Siddharth, who was in finance, and then just was like, I don't want to do this. I want to do something meaningful, and started looking at the darkest corners of our entire supply chain humanity.
Yeah.
And maybe I'll do that, and I'll just give up on all of this nonsense.
At least I feel like we're trying to provide positive content into the world. We're trying to provide informative content, things that make people laugh, things that make it easier to look at the dark content. And that's not just like what I believe. That's many, many people over the years have told us that this helps them. Like dumpster fire helps them, whatever.
Nobody wants this, though. No one wants it. There's some people who do. But I joke, maybe we've maxed out. Maybe I'm not growing because we've found literally our entire audience in 7 billion people.
I really hope that's not true.
How many billions are there? 7,
we just
right?
hit 7.
Yeah,
didn't we? Or did we just hit 8?
I
think we just hit 8.
Fuck. 8 billion people clamoring for cobalt. Yeah, 8 billion. It just hit 8.
Crazy.
In 2022.
Mm-hmm.
8 billion people.
I feel like there were like 4 when we were born. Like we're accelerating rapidly.
It is the singularity. Kurzweil was right. He was talking about population, AI. We're here.
We're here.
It is crazy how that stuff advances, even from the last version of ChatGPT that I feel like we just became aware of. The new version's already better.
I know. Well, I do feel like I'm not sure if humans will survive their own technology. I do feel like if for some reason the technology goes down, like because I've been obsessed with coronal mass ejections or whatever lately, which is very possible and could take down the entire grid for like a year.
It'd probably be good for us.
Millions upon billions of people would probably die, but humans would survive that.
Well, yeah, we would survive that. That's what I was talking to Agnieszka. Thank you. Agnieszka. About I was the Little House on the Prairie writing prompt where it's like, can you imagine, will we even make it to another 150 years, or will the robots become sentient and to decide to nuke us all?
Right.
Or will something like this happen and we'll end up going back, or will we have to unplug the grid because the robots became sentient?
Well, we know what happens when we try that, according to the Terminator movies and the Matrix.
What happened?
When they try to pull the plug, that's when they get wiped out, the humans.
Oh, right. That's when they nuke us.
Yeah.
Sons of bitches that are already way ahead of us.
Of course they are. They're much smarter than we are.
This is what I always think of my friend's freaking stand-up routine, where the robots are going to be like, they knew.
Yeah. This was predicted like in the 80s.
They made movies about this. And still they did it.
They did not stop to learn the lesson.
I just keep thinking about Sam Altman at the frickin' boondoggle that I was at, talking about how we need to just make sure that we cap the growth. If we cap the growth at 5% every year, however they measure the growth of AI, then our institutions will be able to keep up and they won't collapse.
No, they won't.
At 5%.
Yeah, they won't. They won't be able to keep up even if
Maggie,
they cap it.
It's learning at 100%.
I'm sure it is.
Increasing. And he's like, the only way apparently to regulate this is, in his mind, some global regulatory body that does not exist.
Which will never happen.
No, because it's like an arms race.
Yeah, I know. And I feel like, our government's run by like Windows 95.
Well, maybe AI would be a better government than Windows 95. But yeah, China's not going to be like, yeah, sure, we'll cap our AI growth at 5% every year.
Well, this has been a rather uplifting and joyful check-in. We covered the apocalypse in all forms the entire time.
We did we looked at our spreadsheet of ways that the apocalypse is coming. But meanwhile, all you can do is, I think that's why I am enjoying the writing prompts and the content we do put out, is because, yeah, the doomsday clock could be at 1 minute to midnight all the time. But all you can do is keep your shit together in the meantime.
Keep living until the moment it all comes crashing down.
Well, we have some good survivalists coming up.
Oh, yeah. I'm excited for
We're going to pivot to being survival. I still think the best content that we could start creating is two idiots
survivals for morons.
Yeah.
Trying to become survivalists.
Yeah, exactly.
Preppers. And wait, how do I do this?
I think that Mike would be down.
Yeah, that would be some quality content.
Just two morons trying to survive. Story of our lives.
Tune in next week for another riveting episode that will change your life, help you get out of your own way, and solve all the world's problems. I want to thank our composer, Jared Elias, my co-producer and cousin, Maggie, and all of you out there listening. This has been Walk-Ins Welcome with Bridget Phetasy. I'm Bridget Phetasy, and you're welcome. It's the dumbest line.